On November 3rd, 1979, Harold Keene made his final entry in the registration ledger of the Pinewood Motor Lodge. Room 19, single occupancy, cash payment, name listed as J. Morrow. At 2:47 a.m., the night clerk noted the time on a carbon copy receipt, then walked to the ice machine behind the office. He never saw the guest again. Vermont State Police ruled it a voluntary departure. Case closed in 6 days. The guest had simply left. People do that. They check in, they check out, they vanish into the Green Mountains, and nobody asks questions. But they didn't explain why the room key was found 3 miles away, at the bottom of Lake Willoughby, or why the bed had been slept in, but the sheets were missing, or why Harold Keene, after 40 years of meticulous record-keeping, had written the registration card in handwriting that wasn't his own. Catherine Voss had been with the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit for 11 years. Most of that time, she'd reviewed hunting accidents and drownings, cases where the question wasn't what happened, but whether anyone cared enough to write it down properly. The Pinewood file had been sitting in a basement storage room in Montpelier since 1980. Water damage had warped the manila folder. Someone had written "No follow-up" in red grease pencil across the tab. Voss spread the contents across her desk. 6 registration cards, 3 witness statements, a Polaroid of room 19's interior, and a property inventory that listed 14 items, including 1 set of car keys for a vehicle that was never found. She picked up the registration card for November 3rd. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical. J. Morrow. No address, no license plate number. The space for make, model of vehicle had been left blank. The Pinewood Motor Lodge sat 14 miles north of St. Johnsbury, on a stretch of Route 5 that saw more logging trucks than tourists. The original owner, Earl Pinewood, had built it in 1952 for the summer lake traffic. By 1979, his son Harold ran it alone, and the summer traffic had moved to newer motels closer to the interstate. Voss studied the Polaroid. Room 19 was identical to the other 18 rooms. Mustard yellow bedspread, avocado bathroom fixtures, wood-paneled walls with a single landscape print. The bed was unmade. A lamp had been knocked to the floor. The closet door was open, revealing empty hangers. The incident report noted no signs of struggle. The investigating officer, a Sergeant Pelletier, had written that the guest appeared to have departed in haste but without distress. Voss turned the Polaroid over. Someone had written 11/4/79/0630 on the back. The photo was taken the morning after. But according to the file, no one reported anything unusual until November 5th. The witness statements were typed on onion skin paper, the kind that smudged if you touched it wrong. 3 names: Harold Keene, the owner, Donna Pruitt, who cleaned rooms, and a guest named Walter Fisk, who had been staying in room 12. Harold Keene's statement was brief. Guest checked in around 10 p.m., paid cash, didn't say much. Keene went to bed at midnight, heard nothing unusual, discovered the empty room when Donna reported the door standing open the next morning. Donna Pruitt's statement matched. She'd arrived at 6 a.m., saw the door ajar, found the room empty, called Harold. Walter Fisk's statement was different. He'd heard a car engine around 3 a.m., 2 doors closing, then nothing. Voss underlined the discrepancy. Harold Keene said he heard nothing. Walter Fisk heard 2 doors. The investigating officer hadn't noted the contradiction. The Pinewood Motor Lodge still stood, though the sign had been dark for 6 years. Voss pulled her state vehicle into the empty lot and sat for a moment, watching fog drift across the pavement. The building had the defeated look of places that stopped being maintained. Paint peeling in strips, roof sagging over the office, room doors hanging at angles on rusted hinges. She walked to room 19. The door was gone entirely, torn off and never replaced. Inside, the mustard bedspread had been stripped away, leaving a bare mattress stained with water damage. The avocado fixtures in the bathroom were cracked but still bolted to the wall. Voss stood in the doorway and counted paces. 14 steps to the office. Another 20 to the ice machine Harold Keene had mentioned. From room 12, where Walter Fisk had been staying, the distance was shorter, maybe 40 feet, close enough to hear 2 car doors, close enough to see who was driving. Harold Keene had died in 1983, a heart attack behind the counter of the motel he never sold. His widow, Marion, still lived in Lyndonville, in a house with aluminum siding and a chain-link fence. She answered the door in a housecoat, squinting at Voss's badge like she needed glasses she refused to wear.
That's state police. Harold always said state police meant trouble.
Mrs. Keene, I'm reviewing an old case. November 1979. A guest who went missing from room 19.
Marion's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the doorframe.
I don't remember every guest Harold had.
This one left without his car keys. The room key turned up in Lake Willoughby.
People lose things.
They found the key 3 miles from the motel, in 50 feet of water.
Marion Keene looked past Voss, toward the road, as if expecting someone.
Harold handled the guests. I handled the books. That's all I know.
The motel's financial records had been seized after Harold Keene's death, part of a probate dispute that never went anywhere. They sat in cardboard boxes in the Caledonia County Courthouse, gathering dust alongside 40 years of other forgotten paperwork. Voss signed the access log and carried 3 boxes to a reading table. Registration cards, receipts, bank deposit slips. Harold Keene had been meticulous, just as the file suggested. Every transaction recorded, every guest logged. She found November 1979 in the second box. The registration cards were arranged by date. November 1st, 2 guests. November 2nd, 1 guest. November 3rd, the card for room 19 was missing. Voss checked again. The cards jumped from November 2nd to November 4th. The original registration card, the one with the handwriting that wasn't Harold's, existed only as a photocopy in the police file. Someone had removed the original, and they'd done it before the probate inventory. Walter Fisk had been 63 in 1979. The file listed an address in Barry, a granite-cutting town 40 miles southwest. Voss called the number from a payphone outside the courthouse. A woman answered. Fisk's daughter. Her father had passed in 1991, but she remembered him talking about that night at the motel. Fisk's daughter. He always said he should have told them more. The police, I mean. But they didn't seem interested.
What did he want to tell them? He saw the car, the one that came for the man in room 19. He wrote down the plate number, but the officer said they didn't need it.
Voss felt the phone cord tighten in her grip.
Did your father keep that number? He kept everything. Hold on.
Paper rustling, a drawer opening. Then the daughter's voice, reading off 7 characters. Vermont plates. A number that should have been in the file, but wasn't. The plate number traced to a 1974 Ford pickup, registered to a company called Northern Transport Services, based in Newport, near the Canadian border. Voss pulled the corporate filings from the Secretary of State's office. Northern Transport had been incorporated in 1971. 3 principals: Gerald Toomey, Robert Strand, and a silent partner listed only by initials. DP. The company had dissolved in 1982. Assets liquidated. No forwarding address. Voss cross-referenced the names. Gerald Toomey had died in 1985. A single-vehicle accident on an icy road. Robert Strand had moved to Florida in 1983 and dropped off the records entirely. That left the initials. DP. She went back to the witness statements. Donna Pruitt. The cleaning woman. First name Donna. Last initial P. The woman who found room 19 empty had been a partner in the company whose truck arrived at 3 a.m. Donna Pruitt still lived in the area. Voss found her in the phone book, listed at a rural route address outside of Barton. The house was a converted farmstead with a collapsed barn and 3 rusted vehicles in the yard. She answered the door with a cigarette in her hand. a woman in her 60s with the worn look of someone who'd worked physical jobs all her life.
Mrs. Pruitt, I'm Investigator Voss, Vermont State Police. I'm reviewing the 1979 case at the Pinewood Motor Lodge.
Donna Pruitt took a long drag on her cigarette. Her eyes didn't waver.
That was a long time ago.
You were a partner in Northern Transport Services.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Your initials are on the corporate filing. D.P. Donna Pruitt.
The cigarette paused halfway to her lips.
Lots of people have those initials.
The company truck was at the motel that night. Walter Fisk saw it.
Walter Fisk is dead.
His daughter has the plate number.
Donna Pruitt closed the door without another word. Voss drove back to Montpelier and pulled the original incident report filed by Sergeant Pelletier. She wanted to know why a witness's license plate number never made it into the file. Pelletier had retired in 1988. His personnel record showed commendations for traffic enforcement and community relations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why an investigation closed in 6 days with obvious leads unexplored. She found his retirement address in Hardwick, a small town in the hills. When she called, a woman answered, his wife, and said he'd be happy to talk about the old days. Pelletier met her on his front porch, a man in his 70s with the careful posture of someone managing back pain. He shook her hand and offered coffee.
The Pinewood case? Haven't thought about that in years.
You closed it quickly.
Nothing to close. Guest left. Happens all the time.
A witness gave you a plate number. It's not in the file.
Pelletier's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth.
I don't recall that.
Pelletier's memory was selective. He remembered the motel, the empty room, the missing guest. He didn't remember Walter Fisk, the plate number, or why the investigation ended so fast.
Sergeant, the room key was found in Lake Willoughby, 3 miles from the motel. Did you investigate how it got there?
Lake's public. Anyone could have thrown it there.
After the guest disappeared?
We had no evidence of foul play.
The bed sheets were missing.
Guests steal sheets. Towels, too.
And the car keys? For a vehicle that was never found?
Pelletier set down his coffee cup. His hands, Voss noticed, had developed a slight tremor.
Miss Voss, that case was reviewed by my supervisor and closed. If there were problems with the investigation, someone would have said something in 40 years.
I'm saying something now.
Then you're wasting your time. And mine.
Voss drove to Lake Willoughby that afternoon. The lake stretched between 2 mountains, deep and cold, the kind of water that kept its secrets. She parked at the public access and walked to the spot where the dive team had recovered the room key in 1979. According to the report, the key had been found 50 feet down, resting on a granite ledge. The diver noted it was the only object in the area. No wallet, no clothes, no body. She studied the shoreline. The nearest road access was a quarter-mile north, a pullout used by ice fishermen in winter. In November 1979, it would have been empty. Someone had driven here in the dark, walked to the water's edge, and thrown a room key into the deepest part of the lake. They hadn't dumped it from a bridge or dropped it in a stream. They'd chosen a spot where it would sink and stay. That wasn't a guest leaving in a hurry. That was evidence disposal. Northern Transport Services had operated out of Newport, 5 miles from the Canadian border. Voss pulled the company's shipping manifests from customs archives, the few that survived anyway. The business had been unremarkable on paper. Furniture deliveries, household goods, the occasional commercial shipment. Revenue modest but steady. No red flags. But the destinations caught her attention. The company made frequent runs to Montreal, sometimes twice a week. For a 3-person operation with 2 trucks, that was a lot of border crossings. She cross-referenced the dates with Harold Keene's registration logs. A pattern emerged. Every time Northern Transport made a Montreal run, the Pinewood Motor Lodge had a late-night guest who paid cash and left no forwarding address. 6 times in 1979 alone. 6 guests who checked in after 10 p.m., departed before dawn, and left no trace except a registration card written in handwriting that didn't match Harold Keene's. The pattern suggested a way station, a place where cargo or people could rest before crossing the border. The Pinewood was perfectly positioned, isolated, discreet, and run by an owner who apparently didn't ask questions. But something had gone wrong on November 3rd. The guest in room 19 hadn't made it to Montreal. His room key ended up at the bottom of a lake, and the investigation that followed was closed before it started. Voss pulled the autopsy records for Gerald Toomey, the Northern Transport partner who died in 1985. Single vehicle accident, icy road. No witnesses. The medical examiner noted alcohol in his system, but the level was barely above legal. The car had gone off a cliff on Route 14, a road Toomey drove regularly. No mechanical failure. No skid marks. The death had been ruled accidental. Like everything else connected to this case, it was closed without questions. Robert Strand, the second partner, had left Vermont in 1983. His forwarding address led to a trailer park in Sarasota, Florida. Voss called the manager, who said Strand had died in 1989. Natural causes. Heart failure. That left Donna Pruitt as the only surviving principal of Northern Transport Services. The woman who'd found room 19 empty. The woman who'd closed the door in Voss's face. Voss drove back to Barton the next morning. This time, she didn't knock. She parked across the road and waited. At 9:15, a pickup truck pulled into Donna's driveway. A man in his 50s got out. Work boots, canvas jacket, the build of someone who loaded trucks for a living. He went inside without knocking. Voss wrote down the plate number. Then she waited some more. At 10:30, the man left. Donna watched him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. Whatever they'd discussed, it hadn't been pleasant. The truck belonged to Dennis Pruitt, Donna's son. He worked at a lumber yard in Orleans, had a mortgage, and a wife and 3 kids. Clean record except for a DUI in 1975. Voss found him at the lumber yard during his lunch break, eating a sandwich in his truck. He watched her approach with the wariness of a man who'd been expecting bad news.
Mr. Pruitt, I'm Investigator Voss. I'm looking into an old case your mother was involved in.
My mother's not involved in anything.
She was a partner in Northern Transport Services. The company ran shipments across the border.
That was 40 years ago.
A man disappeared from the Pinewood Motor Lodge. Your mother found the room. Your mother's company truck was there that night.
Dennis Pruitt set down his sandwich. His jaw tightened.
I was 12 years old. I don't know anything about that.
But you know something now. You were at your mother's house this morning. She looked upset when you left.
That's family business.
So is whatever happened in room 19.
Dennis Pruitt didn't talk that day, but his reaction told Voss enough. He knew something, and whatever it was had been weighing on him for decades. She returned to the archives and pulled immigration records from the late 1970s. Northern Transport's Montreal runs coincided with something else. A surge in asylum seekers from Southeast Asia. Refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia looking for ways into the United States. The official channels were slow, bureaucratic, backlogged. But there were other ways. Unofficial ways. Ways that involved cash payments and remote border crossings and motels where no one asked for identification. The Pinewood Motor Lodge was 14 miles from Canada. Close enough to make the crossing in a single night. Close enough to disappear if something went wrong. Voss looked at the registration cards again. J. Morrow, T. Anderson, R. Phillips. American names, generic and forgettable. The kind of name someone would give if they didn't want to be remembered. Human smuggling. That was one possibility. But it didn't explain everything. The refugees Voss read about were desperate, poor, grateful for any help. They didn't disappear from motel rooms. They didn't have their keys thrown into lakes. She went back to the customs manifests. Northern Transport's shipments to Montreal were listed as household goods, furniture, personal effects. Standard cargo for a moving company, but the weight logs didn't match. A truck that was supposed to carry 2,000 pounds of furniture was crossing the border at 3,500. Every time. Consistently overweight by the same margin. Something was going north that wasn't furniture. And whatever came back wasn't refugees. Voss pulled the DEA reports from the late 1970s. Vermont had been a pipeline then. Heroin from Montreal. Cocaine from Miami. all of it moving through rural routes where the police presence was thin and the locals minded their own business. The Pinewood Motor Lodge sat on one of those routes, and Harold Keene had kept meticulous records of everyone who passed through. Drugs going north, money coming south. The Pinewood as a way station where couriers could rest before the border crossing. Harold Keene as the man who looked the other way. It explained the cash payments, the fake names, the late-night arrivals, and explained why Donna Pruitt had been on the scene every time. She wasn't just cleaning rooms, she was running logistics, but it didn't explain what happened in room 19. The courier, if that's what Jay Morrow was, had vanished. His key had been disposed of, his sheets had been taken, and the investigation had been shut down before it started. Someone had made a decision that night. Someone had decided the guest in room 19 was a problem that needed to disappear. Voss looked at the list of names again. Harold Keene, dead. Gerald Toomey, dead. Robert Strand, dead. Sergeant Pelletier, retired and hostile. Donna Pruitt, silent. Everyone who knew what happened was gone or wasn't talking. Except one person, the silent partner whose initials weren't on any of the witness statements. Voss drove back to Lindenville the next morning. Marion Keene was working in her garden, pulling weeds from a flower bed that had seen better days.
Mrs. Keene, I have some questions about Northern Transport Services.
I told you, I handled the books. That's all.
You handled the books for the motel, but Northern Transport had a silent partner, initials only, on the corporate filing.
Marion stood up slowly, dirt on her knees, a trowel in her hand.
I don't know anything about that.
The trucks came to your motel 6 times in 1979. Every time, a guest checked in late and left before dawn. Every time, Harold wrote the registration card in someone else's handwriting.
Harold was careful. He didn't want trouble.
Trouble came anyway, on November 3rd.
Marion Keene's face didn't change, but her grip on the trowel tightened until her knuckles went white.
You should leave now.
Who was the silent partner, Mrs. Keene?
I said leave.
The silent partner. Someone with enough money to invest in a trucking company, but enough caution to keep their name off the public records. Voss went back to the corporate filings. The original incorporation documents listed the 3 principals and their investment amounts. Toomey and Strand had each put in $5,000. The silent partner, DP, had contributed $15,000. In 1971, $15,000 was real money. Working class people didn't have that kind of cash lying around, but someone who'd been skimming from another operation might. She pulled Harold Keene's bank records from the probate file. Before 1971, his deposits matched the motel's income. Seasonal, modest, predictable. After 1971, there were irregular cash deposits. Small amounts, a few hundred at a time, but consistent. Harold Keene hadn't just looked the other way. He'd been taking a cut. And someone had provided the startup capital for the whole operation. DP wasn't Donna Pruitt. Donna Pruitt was listed separately by full name on the same document. DP was someone else entirely. Voss pulled the property records for the land around the Pinewood Motor Lodge. The motel sat on 2 acres that Harold Keene had purchased in 1952. But the adjacent parcel, 50 acres of woods running to the Canadian border, had a different owner. The land belonged to a trust, established in 1968. The trustee was a law firm in Burlington that had dissolved in 1985. The beneficiary was listed only by initials, D.P., the same initials on the Northern Transport filing, the same initials on property that connected the motel to the border. Voss called the Vermont Bar Association and asked about the dissolved law firm. The receptionist was helpful. The firm's records had been transferred to a successor practice in Montpelier. She drove there that afternoon. The lawyer who met her was young, barely 30, handling cases that predated his career.
The DP Trust, that's been dormant for decades. The beneficiary never claimed the assets.
Who was the beneficiary?
I'd need a court order to release that. Privacy concerns.
This is a state police investigation.
The lawyer hesitated, then pulled a file from his drawer. The beneficiary of the DP Trust was Donald Pelletier, the same last name as the sergeant who'd investigated and closed the Pinewood case in 1979. Voss drove back to Hardwick that evening. Sergeant Pelletier wasn't on his porch this time. His wife said he'd gone to bed early, wasn't feeling well.
Mrs. Peltier, is Donald your husband's brother? Cousin?
Donald was Raymond's father, passed in 76. Why do you ask?
Voss felt the pieces click into place. Donald Pelletier had owned the land. Donald Pelletier had invested in Northern Transport. And when something went wrong at the motel, his son, a state police sergeant, had been the one to close the case.
Mrs. Pelletier, I need to speak with your husband again.
He's not well.
This is important.
Important enough to dig up a dead man's name?
She closed the door. Through the window, Voss could see her walking toward the back of the house, toward a room where the lights were still on. Donald Pelletier, the silent partner, the man who owned the land, funded the operation, and had a son in the state police to clean up any problems. Voss sat in her car outside the Pelletier house and reconstructed the timeline. Donald Pelletier had died in 1976, 3 years before the incident at the Pinewood. By then, the operation was running smoothly. Trucks crossing the border, couriers resting at the motel, money flowing in all directions. But Donald's death had created a problem. The silent partner was gone, and his son Raymond inherited the secret along with the land. A state police sergeant who suddenly had a very personal interest in making sure nobody looked too closely at rural motels near the border. When Jay Morrow disappeared from room 19, Raymond Pelletier had been the responding officer. He'd taken Walter Fisk's plate number and buried it. He'd closed the case in 6 days. He'd made sure nobody asked questions. The question was, had he done more than that? Voss spent the next week pulling records. Raymond Pelletier's patrol logs from November 1979. The radio dispatch records. The evidence inventory from room 19. The patrol log showed Pelletier had been on duty the night of November 3rd. He'd received the call about the empty room at 7:15 a.m. on November 4th, but the Polaroid of room 19 had been taken at 6:30 a.m., 45 minutes before the official report. Someone had photographed the room before the police were called. Someone who knew there would be an investigation and wanted a record of what the scene looked like. Voss looked at the Polaroid again, the lamp on the floor, the open closet, the bare hangers, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a boot print on the carpet pointing toward the bathroom. The evidence inventory didn't mention a boot print, didn't mention any footwear evidence at all. Someone had photographed it and then made sure it disappeared from the official record. The boot print led somewhere. Voss contacted the state crime lab and asked if any footwear evidence had been submitted in November 1979 from Caledonia County. The technician checked the archives.
We have one submission. Case number matches your file. Boot impression, photographed at scene, never processed.
Why not?
Says here the investigating officer determined it wasn't relevant. Guest's own boot, he wrote.
The guest who disappeared without his car keys or his sheets.
I just file what they send me.
Voss had the lab pull the photograph. The boot print was clear, a work boot, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. She compared it to the Polaroid. Same print, same location. But the Polaroid showed something else. A second partial print overlapping the first. 2 people had stood in that spot. 2 people wearing different boots. The evidence hadn't been ignored by accident. It had been deliberately suppressed. 2 people in the room. 2 sets of boots. 1 guest who never left. Voss drove to Lake Willoughby again, this time with the dive team's original report. The room key had been found at specific coordinates, logged by the diver. She plotted the location on a topographic map. The key had sunk in the deepest part of the lake, a trench that dropped to 300 feet. But the shoreline access point was a quarter mile from the trench. Someone had thrown the key from a boat, or from the ice. In early November 1979, the lake wouldn't have been frozen. but a boat could have reached that spot in 20 minutes from the public launch. She checked the marina records. 2 boats had been registered at the lake that November. One belonged to a summer resident who'd already closed his cottage. The other belonged to a fishing club based in Barton. The club's president in 1979 was Gerald Toomey, the same Gerald Toomey who died in a single-vehicle accident 6 years later. Gerald Toomey had owned a boat on Lake Willoughby. Gerald Toomey had been a partner in Northern Transport. And Gerald Toomey had died on an icy road in 1985, 6 years after a guest disappeared from the Pinewood Motor Lodge. Voss pulled the accident report again. Single vehicle, no witnesses. Blood alcohol barely above legal. Car went off a cliff on Route 14. Route 14 ran past the Pinewood Motor Lodge, past the lake access, past the land that Donald Pelletier had owned. She drove the route herself, counting the curves, noting the drop-offs. The spot where Toomey died was marked by a small cross, weathered by decades of Vermont winters. The cliff below was steep but not vertical. A car going off would tumble, not fall. Voss parked and walked to the edge. Below, she could see the rusted remains of a guardrail that had been replaced. The original rail, according to the accident report, had been damaged in the crash, but the damage pattern was wrong. The rail had been bent outward, as if something had pushed through from the road. A car losing control would have scraped along the rail, not punched through it. Gerald Toomey's death hadn't been an accident. Someone had pushed his car off that cliff, just like someone had thrown a room key into Lake Willoughby. The operation had been running for years. Drugs north, money south. Couriers resting at the Pinewood, while Donna Pruitt handled logistics, and Harold Keene looked the other way. Raymond Pelletier covered their tracks whenever something drew attention, but in November 1979, something had gone wrong. The courier in room 19, Jay Morrow, whatever his real name was, had become a problem. Maybe he'd tried to skim. Maybe he'd threatened to talk. Maybe he'd just seen something he shouldn't have. They dealt with him. Taken the sheets, probably wrapped around a body. Driven to the lake, disposed of the evidence. Thrown the room key into deep water where no one would find it, except someone had found it. A fisherman, 3 weeks later, had snagged the key on his line. And that's when the cleanup started. Voss had the shape of it now, but she needed confirmation. She needed someone to break. She drove back to Donna Pruitt's house. This time, she didn't wait. She walked to the door and knocked hard enough to rattle the frame. Donna answered in the same housecoat, the same cigarette, the same hostile stare.
Gerald Toomey didn't die in an accident.
I don't know anything about that.
He was pushed off that cliff, same way the man in room 19 was pushed into that lake.
You're crazy.
Raymond Pelletier's father funded your operation. Raymond covered it up when things went wrong. And when Gerald started getting nervous, someone made sure he wouldn't talk.
Donna's cigarette had burned down to the filter. She didn't seem to notice.
You can't prove any of this.
I can prove the truck was there. I can prove the investigation was buried. I can prove Pelletier's father owned the land your drugs crossed.
Donna Pruitt's face went pale. Not from fear, from anger.
You don't know what you're stirring up.
Tell me what happened in room 19.
Nothing happened. The guest left.
His body's in that lake, isn't it?
Donna's hand trembled, the first crack in her composure.
You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like that.
Like what?
He was stealing, skimming from the shipments. Toomey found out. He was going to handle it. Just talk to him, that's all.
But Toomey did more than talk.
I wasn't there. I found the room in the morning, like I said. The door was open. The bed was...
She stopped, lit another cigarette with shaking hands.
There was blood on the sheets. Not a lot, but enough. Toomey said he'd take care of it.
And Pelletier?
Raymond came later. Made sure the report was clean. Said we'd all go down if anyone found out.
Who killed the man in room 19?
I told you. I wasn't there.
But you know.
Donna Pruitt looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said nothing at all. Donna Pruitt had given her a fragment, blood on the sheets, Toomey's involvement. Pelletier's cleanup. But she hadn't named the killer. She'd said Toomey would handle it, not that Toomey had done the handling. Voss drove back to Hardwick. This time, she didn't knock on the door. She waited until Raymond Pelletier came out to get his mail. He saw her car and stopped. For a long moment, they just looked at each other.
You're persistent.
Your father owned the land. He funded the operation. When he died, you inherited both.
My father was a farmer. He owned some woods. That's all.
Donna Pruitt told me about the blood in room 19. She told me you cleaned up the report.
Pelletier's face didn't change, but his hand tightened on the mailbox.
Donna Pruitt is a bitter old woman who'd say anything to cause trouble.
Then explain the boot print. 2 sets of prints in that room. One was the victim's. Whose was the other?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Size 11 work boot. Distinctive heel wear. I can get your old boots from evidence storage, Sergeant. They keep everything.
Pelletier's face went gray. Not the gray of fear. The gray of a man who'd been carrying something for 40 years and had just felt the weight shift.
You don't know what it was like. My father built that operation, kept this whole county afloat when the farms were failing. People needed work, needed money. He provided it.
By smuggling drugs across the border.
By keeping families fed. You think the state police salary covered my mother's medical bills? You think honest work paid for any of this?
And when the courier in room 19 threatened to expose it?
He was going to talk. Had the names, the routes, everything. Said he'd go to the feds unless we cut him in for more.
So you killed him.
Pelletier's hands dropped to his sides. His shoulders sagged.
Toomey was supposed to scare him, just scare him. But Toomey wasn't good at stopping.
And you were there.
I was there to clean up. That's all. That's what I always did. Clean up.
Voss sat in her car outside the Pelletier house and wrote down everything. Toomey had killed the courier. Pelletier had cleaned up the scene. Together, they'd wrapped the body in the sheets and taken it to Lake Willoughby. The room key had been thrown in to sync with the body, but it had separated somehow, caught on something, drifted, ended up on a ledge where a fisherman's hook could find it. When the key surfaced, Pelletier had closed the investigation before anyone could connect it to the motel. He'd buried Walter Fisk's plate number, suppressed the boot print evidence, and written a report that explained nothing because nothing was supposed to be explained. 6 years later, when Gerald Toomey started drinking too much and talking too loud, someone had made sure he joined the courier at the bottom of a Vermont hillside. Pelletier said he'd only cleaned up. But cleanup was just another word for conspiracy. And conspiracy to cover a murder was still murder in the eyes of the law. Voss called her supervisor from a payphone in Hardwick. She laid out the evidence, the corporate connections, the suppressed boot print, the falsified investigation, Pelletier's admission that he'd been present when the body was disposed of.
He admitted to being there?
He said Toomey did the killing. He said he just cleaned up.
That's still accessory after the fact. Maybe conspiracy.
We need to move on this. Pelletier's 73 years old. He could die before we build a case.
What about the body?
Lake Willoughby, 300 feet deep in places. We'd need divers, equipment, a search grid.
Without a body, it's his word against Donna Pruitt's. And she didn't see the killing either.
The boot print matches. The patrol logs match. The corporate records prove the connection.
I'll run it past the DA, but Catherine, 40-year-old cases don't usually end with convictions. They end with reports.
Voss hung up the phone and stood in the cold Vermont air, watching her breath fog in front of her. The next morning, Voss drove to the Caledonia County DA's office in St. Johnsbury. She brought everything: the registration cards, the boot print photographs, the corporate filings, the patrol logs, and her notes from both Donna Pruitt and Raymond Pelletier. The DA was a woman named Enright, who'd been prosecuting cases in Vermont for 30 years. She listened without interrupting, then spread the documents across her desk like a dealer arranging cards.
You have a lot of circumstantial evidence,
And a confession from Pelletier that he was present during the disposal.
which he'll recant the moment a lawyer gets involved. I was confused. I was elderly. I didn't understand the question.
What about the boot print?
The original evidence was never processed. Chain of custody is broken. Any defense attorney would tear it apart.
So we do nothing?
I didn't say that. I said we don't have enough for a prosecution. But we have enough to reopen the case. Put it on the record.
Enright stamped the file folder with a single word. Reopened. Voss drove back to the Pinewood Motor Lodge one last time. The building stood in the same defeated silence, doors hanging open, fog drifting through the parking lot. She walked to room 19 and stood in the doorway. 40 years ago, a man had checked in here under a false name. He'd planned to cross the border with money he'd skimmed from a smuggling operation. He'd thought he was clever enough to get away with it. Gerald Toomey had proved him wrong. Raymond Pelletier had made sure no one would ever know. But Pelletier had made a mistake. He'd taken a photograph before the cleanup, evidence of his own thoroughness that had sat in a file for 4 decades, waiting for someone to look closely at the corner of the frame. The boot print had been his undoing. The same careful documentation that made him a good cop had preserved the evidence of his crime. Voss pulled the door closed behind her. It didn't latch, the frame was too warped, but the gesture felt right. Something was ending here. Raymond Pelletier died 3 weeks later. Heart failure, the doctor said. His wife found him in his chair by the window, looking out at the same view he'd watched for 40 years. The case file remained open, but without a living suspect, there would be no trial. The DA attached Voss's report to the record, a detailed account of how a man had died in a motel room, how his body had been dumped in a lake, and how a state police sergeant had spent his career making sure no one found out. Donna Pruitt refused to testify. Marion Keene said nothing more. The body at the bottom of Lake Willoughby stayed where it had been for 4 decades. Too deep to recover without resources the state wouldn't authorize for a closed case. In the end, the only justice was the record itself, a permanent accounting of what had happened and who was responsible. The truth, written down where it couldn't be erased. The file was stamped closed, inconclusive, and returned to storage. The Pinewood Motor Lodge was demolished in the spring of 1980. The land was sold to a logging company that clear-cut the timber and abandoned the property. Within a decade, the forest had reclaimed everything: the foundation, the parking lot, the spot where room 19 had stood. Lake Willoughby kept its secrets. The water was too cold, too deep, too dark for casual exploration. Whatever lay at the bottom, a body wrapped in mustard yellow sheets, a room key that had floated free, the evidence of a crime that took 40 years to name, would stay there. Voss filed her report and moved on to the next case. There were always more files in the basement, more names on manila folders, more questions that had been marked "no follow-up" and forgotten, but she kept a copy of the Polaroid, the one with the boot print in the corner, the one that had been taken 45 minutes before anyone called the police. Some evidence, she'd learned, was worth keeping, even when the case was closed.